So I'll give you one more example of a, again, highly edited series of searches made by a third person. And this is a person who, at the beginning of these searches, is contemplating having an affair with someone that she may have contacted online. And typically, for an internet search user, she begins by doing some research. At the same time, she seems to be trying to cope with having a dollar for a husband or a partner. A little while later, she seems to be about to take the plunge with an online affair. And a little while later, the deed seems to have been done. Now, shortly after that, the things appear to go a little bit awry. And she's regretting taking cybersex to a physical level. She's becoming paranoid and thinks that her partner might be tracking her movements and her actions. And she's hurling out into the kind of electronic ether. Because these things are often like confessional boxes as well as oracles for, why are affairs so complicated. A couple of minutes later, there's a very quick change to her thought process. She's thinking about buying some furniture, perhaps some kind of therapeutic relief. She's worried about the kind of man who spends a lot of time on the internet chatting. She's worried or concerned about treating computer addiction, perhaps her own, perhaps that of her online affairee. And at the end of this, very sweetly, she's thinking about how to be nicer to the man in her life, although we're not quite sure which man, I suppose. So thus far, I've said something about what we may or may not be able to tell about people from what they type into search engines, and speculated about how in the long term our propensity for using these things might be changing the way that we want to process or order information. But just to finish, let's talk about what comes out the other end. Because you see, lots of things come out the other end. It turns out that Google and Facebook now have so much data about us at their fingertips that they simply can't build the warehouses fast enough. Warehouses are expensive, computer servers are expensive, Facebook's making no money. And it's being forced to construct these massive warehouses to house all the data that we're giving it. At the same time that we're incredibly concerned about, what Google Street View and its little cars can see about our rickety front doors, we're upstairs in the spare room typing our innermost thoughts and having it straight over to the server in Ohio. Given the abundance of all of this information that we type in, some idea entrepreneurs, very influential idea entrepreneurs, people like Chris Anderson, who's the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine in the US, would argue that really we don't need social science anymore because there's not so much data out there about ourselves. We don't really need ideas because all we need to do is crunch the information and keep crunching that information with very sophisticated tools, and anything, more or less anything that we want to know will come out the other end. Now, when people like Chris Anderson made that argument, he did so in a very influential article called The End of Science. He's referring back, or he's in the same tradition as Marshall McLuhan, another guru of cybernetics, who sometimes argued in his most optimistic moments that when we were all hooked up to this electronic information loop, the thing in the middle, hooking us all up, would function and look very much like a kind of global brain, which would teach us more or less all that we needed to know. Now, I don't think when we look out our windows onto this place I call Cyburbia today, what we see looks much like a global brain. Instead, as I've intimated, this kind of worrying electronic information loop between us and our search boxes means that what turns up, what tumbles out onto that search box, feels very much like a kind of collective unconscious, a kind of electronic id, which can, a kind of constantly updated printout of our psyche collectively. And as such, I predict that this kind of electronic unconscious is going to completely change the voting business. And it's going to prove a goldmine to those experts, marketers, people who are clever and rich enough to exploit this information. And the reason why it's so good is because it seems to, in a lot of instances, burrow under traditional measures of what we think in passing terms about things. So to give you an example, I mean, when I was writing this book, I visited Google's London offices in January 2008, and they were teaching me how to use this thing called Google Trends, which many of you will know about. It was relatively new then, and Google Trends works in the way that you can check the relative frequency with which internet search keywords are used on a graph looking at two different keywords. So at the beginning of 2008, I typed in Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And this was at a time when Hillary Clinton was doing pretty well in the campaign for the Democratic nomination during the presidential election. But using something like Google Trends, it was pretty easy to see with great sophistication the kind of growth in public interest in Barack Obama versus the waning of public interest in Hillary Clinton. What came out looked very much like a kind of eerily immediate chronicle of the public mood. Now, Google isn't the only company which is kind of trying to get a handle on our collective unconscious, our kind of electronic id. It turns out that many of the companies and institutions that we thought we'd left behind when we disappeared off to the spare room or zoned out of work to type these things into our search engines, many of them have followed us there. And they're interested in using all this information to find out what we're saying about them, or simply to get inside our heads. You know, there are now somewhere between 40 million and 200 million blogs in the world. And most of them are very dull, except to, you know, the family and friends of the people who read them, and that's often what they're for. But if you look at things through the other end of the looking glass, then you can tell lots of interesting things by crunching all of that data. Now, because I've written that I had a certain kind of muesli for breakfast, that may not be so interesting for a company or an institution, but if you can crunch that data and track the connections between various kinds of muesli and various kinds of people, then that is very, very useful for companies. Another thing that's very useful for companies is this emerging discipline called behavioral advertising, or interest-led advertising, or behavioral targeting, by which companies like Google and Form are tracking the way that we move around the internet in order to get a handle on who we are. And that, I predict, is going to completely change the business of marketing demographics, the business of chopping people up into discrete groups in order to sell them more stuff. Another example is that the financial services industry is investing very heavily in automated systems to track market chatter. Again, to trace the connections between little bits of this information to see if anything is in the offing. The security services, too, are spending vast sums of money on automated systems which try and help them track trends in internet chatter. Again, not looking at any individual, but trying to track general trends in chatter on the jihadi web to ascertain when the next terrorist attack might be in the offing. But what seems terribly ironic to me is that in a place where we've spent so much energy, or many people have spent so much energy, burrowing around the purview of the authorities, that's what the internet was initially created for by electro hippies in California, then at the end of all that, all of our innermost thoughts, desires, impulses, and everything else end up somewhere in this bank of computer servers in Ohio, being hosed down by a warehouse man, because these servers get very hot and sold off often to the highest bidder. Thanks.